Daniel Price stood on the quiet edge of the observation deck and tried to calm his hands. The deck curved like a glass shell around the docking ring, and the alien fleet filled the view like a city of silver islands. Ships moved with slow grace. Tugcraft pulsed blue light. Cargo lines crossed in tidy patterns. To other visitors, it looked perfect. To Daniel, it looked like a system that could fail in many small hidden ways if the math behind it was wrong. He was not a famous person. He was a systems engineer from Ohio who loved small problems more than big speeches. He had grown up fixing radios in his dad's garage, learning patience by turning screws and tracing wires. He liked numbers because they told the truth when people did not. He never chased titles. He chased the moment when a messy question became a clean answer. That was why he was here, far from home, wearing a visitor badge on an alien station he could barely pronounce. The Arcanis Alliance had invited Earth to watch the great crossing of the Rift Corridor. It would be the largest convoy anyone had tried in years. Warships, freighters, research vessels, seed arcs with forests inside their hulls, hospital tenders, and 1,000 support craft. The corridor was a dangerous path through space where gravity surged like storms at sea. Many called it a shortcut between the quiet arms of the galaxy, but ships often paid a price for using it. The Arcanis believed they had solved the dangers with new stabilizers, smarter software, and stronger hulls. Daniel had come as part of a cultural exchange group. Most humans in the group were diplomats, artists, and teachers. He was the odd one who asked for a seat near the engineering briefings. From the first day, he filled a small notebook with questions. He wrote in neat block letters. He made little diagrams and arrows. He marked lines with circles and short notes like check this, look again. Ask about wave phase. He tried not to bother the alien hosts more than necessary. He knew he was a guest. He knew that many in the Alliance still saw humans as new and untested. But the numbers kept pulling at him. On the second morning, the head of navigation gave a talk about the Rift Corridor's gravity waves. The model on the wall showed gentle, balanced curves. The speaker described the corridor as if it were a dance floor, and the ships were trained partners. The software would listen to the waves and lean into them with perfect timing. The charts looked elegant. The math looked clean. Daniel sat very still. He stared at one equation at the bottom of the slide. It treated the wave pattern as symmetrical over time. That was the first thing that made his skin prickle. He had read old mission logs the night before. Survivors always told the same story. The corridor never stayed steady. It jerked, it twisted. It favored no side for long. It broke symmetry the way weather breaks plans. If you assumed balance, you got hurt. He turned to a friend in the human group, a language researcher named Olivia Brooks, and whispered that the model looked too polite for the real thing. Olivia smiled, said he always worried a little too much and reminded him to eat lunch. He promised he would, but his thoughts stayed with the math. He spent the afternoon in a small lounge with his laptop open and the station's public data feed on the screen. The lounge had a window that looked out over a dock where crews were loading seed canisters. He watched workers guide crates the size of houses and tried not to think about what would happen if the models were wrong, and the fleet went into the corridor with the stabilizers tuned the wrong way. He wrote a simple test in his code. He fed in the stabilizer formula he had copied from the slide. He added a fake wave pattern that leaned hard to one side for several minutes, then flipped and struck from the other side. It was crude. It was not meant to be perfect. It was meant to be honest. The screen traced a line that began steady and then shook. A warning flag blinked. He adjusted a constant and ran it again. The line steadied and then snapped up to a sharp peak. Another flag. He changed the timing of the wave flip and ran it again. This time the output drifted like a ship sliding sideways toward a reef. He breathed out through his nose. His hands felt colder than before. He saved the file, closed the laptop, and told himself not to jump to conclusions after one rough test. That evening, he joined the other observers for a tour of the flagship. The flagship was a beautiful ship with long ribs and a spine of glowing corridors. The guide talked about art pieces in the atrium and the way the hull was grown from crystal seated in a forge. Daniel listened, but his attention kept returning to the stabilizer banks. He stood by a panel and asked a junior tech how the software handled sudden asymmetry. The tech gave a polite answer about safety margins. Daniel thanked him and said no more. When he got back to his guest room, he could not sleep. He washed his face. He sat with the laptop and opened the model again. He pulled down public telemetry from old crossings and mixed it with the Alliance's published wave data. The model grew less polite and more like the survivor stories. He added a few plain rules that his mentors used to call guardrails. They were not elegant. They were not beautiful. They were practical. The output line stopped snapping to peaks. It began to wobble and then recover. He stared at the graphs until the station's lights dimmed for the night cycle. He wrote a summary. He used small words. He kept the tone soft. He did not want to sound like he knew everything. He did not know everything. He knew enough to worry. He tried to send the note to the engineering office listed on the tour pamphlet. The system replied that the inbox was full. He tried a different address. This time the message went through. He attached the data files and the code. He stared at the screen for a long time, then added a single line at the end. It is possible the current assumptions may increase risk in asymmetric conditions. Consider review before convoy launch. He pressed send and sat very still. The next morning began with a ceremony in the Grand Hall. Flags hung like rivers from the ceiling. Music flowed through the air like wind in a canyon. Dignitaries made short speeches. The words were about unity and hope and courage. Daniel tried to let the music carry him, but his mind returned to the model. He decided to try a direct approach. After the ceremony, he walked to the engineering wing and asked at the front desk if he might speak with a senior systems officer. The desk aide, a calm person with soft gray skin and bright eyes, asked for his request in writing. He handed over the summary he had printed. The aide glanced at it, then placed it in a tray. Hours passed. He ate a bowl of soup alone at a window seat and watched shuttles come and go. He told himself he had done his part. He had sent the note. He had been respectful. He did not want to push. He knew he was an outsider, but the idea of staying quiet felt worse with each minute. He stood, carried the bowl to the return slot, and found his feet walking back toward the engineering wing before his mind had fully agreed. This time, he met a mid-level officer in a narrow office with a shelf of ship models. The officer read the first page and then set the paper down. He thanked Daniel for his interest and said the Alliance had the best minds working on the stabilizers. Daniel nodded. He said he understood. He asked if the officer would humor him and look at one graph on the laptop. The officer hesitated, then leaned forward. Daniel clicked a key. The line on the screen slid into a wild sway when the wave flipped. The officer's brow creased. Daniel pressed another key. The adjusted version with guardrails appeared, wobbling but holding. The officer sat back and folded his hands. He said the matter would be passed up the chain. Daniel walked out feeling like he had shouted into a strong wind. He tried to rest in the lounge, but rest would not come. He messaged Olivia and asked if she would read his summary for clarity. She said she would and that she was proud of his careful mind. He smiled at the word careful. He did not feel brave. He felt small. He felt like a man standing at the rail of a vast sea, watching a storm gather on the horizon and holding a single flare. That night he returned to his tests. He built a simple visualization of a ship's stabilizer response. He let the wave come in crooked and hard. He let it stay that way longer than felt fair. He imagined crews asleep and children in the seed arcs dreaming of trees. He adjusted the guardrails to respond a little sooner. He watched the response line steady. He turned the laptop to the window and looked out at the fleet again. The ships were dots of light against the dark, each one a small city, each one a promise. He did not want to be wrong. He wanted to be wrong so badly that it hurt his chest, but the math did not care about his fear. On the third morning, he received a short message asking him to attend a review session as an observer. He read it twice. He straightened his jacket and walked the long corridor to the council room. The room was a ring with consoles arranged like petals. Senior officers spoke in low voices. Projectors hummed. A diagram of the rift corridor hung in the air above the center table. Daniel took a seat in the back and rested his hands on his knees. The presentation began with status updates, timelines, cargo confirmations, health checks on life support gardens. Then someone mentioned a note from a human observer regarding a symmetry risk. Heads turned toward the back of the room. Daniel felt heat rise to his face. A tall woman in a black uniform with silver bands on the sleeves looked at him. She asked his name. He told her. She said her name was Commander Lyra Talvin, and asked him to describe. The morning of the launch ceremony came bright with light streaming across the station's wide halls. The Arcani's alliance had turned the central atrium into a place of celebration. Colorful banners stretched down from the ceiling, each showing a fleet crest. Musicians filled the air with notes that echoed against the polished stone floors. Crowds of visitors gathered to witness history. The fleet was preparing to sail into the Rift Corridor with confidence and pride. Daniel Price stood near the edge of the human delegation, holding his notebook against his chest. He felt small among the crowd of tall aliens, their uniforms shining, their voices proud. He had not slept much. He had spent the night running more tests, and the same problem appeared each time. The stabilizer system expected balance where there was none. His chest felt heavy, but he kept his face calm. He did not want to cause a scene. Yet the thought of silence pressed harder than the fear of speaking. The speeches began. Admirals and dignitaries spoke about courage, vision, and unity. They spoke of safe passage and the glory of the alliance. The crowd clapped and cheered. Daniel listened, but the words seemed far away. His eyes went to the massive display of the fleet hanging in orbit outside the station. Ships lined up in a proud formation, ready to depart. Families stood at windows, children pointing at the warships, their laughter carrying even through the glass. To Daniel, they looked like lives balanced on numbers that were not correct. When the ceremony ended, groups of observers walked through the docking rings to board shuttles for tours. Daniel held back. He knew he had little time. He tried once more to approach someone senior. He spotted Commander Lyra Talvin in the distance. She was speaking to a cluster of officers, her uniform dark with silver bands marking her authority. Daniel hurried forward, holding his notebook open with the graphs ready. He called her name softly. She turned, glanced at him, and offered a polite nod. But her eyes slid past him to another officer, and she returned to her conversation. To her, he was just another visitor, another human still untested in real galactic matters. Daniel felt heat rise in his face. He stopped, stepped back, and told himself not to push too far. He understood. He was a guest. The Arcanis had worked for decades to master the rift, and they believed they had succeeded. Why would they listen to an Earth engineer with no title? Yet he could not let it go. The thought of the fleet entering the corridor as it was made his hands shake. He found a quiet corner in a lounge with wide glass walls. He set his laptop on the table, fingers moving fast. He decided to run one more test, one more attempt to prove the risk was real. He fed in the official stabilizer equations again. Then he built a new wave pattern from pieces of old logs, sharp spikes, sudden drops, long uneven pulls. He pressed enter. The model snapped apart almost at once. Stabilizer drift increased until the ship tilted out of safe range. He pressed his lips tight. He tried again with different timing. The result was the same. He added his guardrails. This time the line wavered, almost toppled, but caught itself and returned. His chest eased for a moment. It was not perfect, but it held. He saved the file and leaned back in the chair. He stared out at the fleet again. The ships gleamed like beads of silver in the dark. He thought about the thousands of lives inside. He imagined children pressing their faces to the glass to watch the stars. He imagined the silence if those lights went out. He knew what he had to do. The next day he asked for permission to attend a council review meeting. At first the aide at the desk frowned. But then, perhaps out of courtesy to the visitors, Daniel was granted a seat at the back. The room was round, filled with long consoles and glowing projectors. Senior officers stood in the center, their voices calm, their words heavy with authority. Diagrams of the rift corridor floated above the table. Timelines scrolled down the sides of the displays. Everyone was confident. Everyone believed the plan would work. Daniel sat still for as long as he could. Then he raised his hand. The officers exchanged glances. One of them nodded. He stood slowly. His voice trembled at first, but he forced himself to speak. He explained that he had studied the stabilizer equations. He said they worked only if the waves of the rift stayed balanced. He said the waves were never balanced. He showed a graph on his screen. He explained how the drift grew until a ship would break apart. The room grew quiet. Some officers frowned. One laughed softly and asked why a human thought he understood the rift better than the alliance. Daniel flushed, but he did not sit down. He said he was not claiming to know more. He was saying the math had a blind spot. He clicked to the second graph, the one with his guardrails. The line shook but did not break. He said this was one way to make the ship safer. Voices rose. Some called it foolish. Others said it was untested and dangerous. But then Commander Lyra spoke. Her voice cut through the noise. She asked Daniel to send his files to her console. He obeyed at once. She opened them, her eyes sharp, moving across lines of code. She asked about a part of the guardrails. He explained his reasoning, his voice low but steady. She asked about another. He answered. At last she leaned back, still silent. The meeting ended with no decision. Officers filed out, some shaking their heads, others whispering. Daniel sank back into his chair. His hands were damp. He thought he had failed. He thought no one had listened. But as the room emptied, Commander Lyra stayed. She walked over to him, her steps calm. She told him that his idea was crude, but sometimes crude tools saved lives when polished ones failed. She said she would test his model with the flagship's parameters. She told him to wait. Daniel left the room with his chest tight but a spark of hope alive inside him. He walked the long corridors of the station, feeling the hum of the systems around him. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of celebration, confidence, and trust in the fleet. But only he and maybe one commander now knew there was a risk hidden beneath all that pride. He pressed his hand to the glass wall, watching the ships outside. They gleamed, strong and silent, ready to leap into the dark. He thought of his father's garage, the way wires could spark if one small thing was wrong, the way machines failed when one loose bolt went ignored. He knew the rift was bigger than any machine, but the rule was the same. One flaw ignored could end everything. He whispered to himself that he would not stop until someone fixed it. Later that night, alone in his guest quarters, he ran the model again. He adjusted numbers, tested new guardrails, pushed the waves harder, longer, sharper. Each time the ships wavered but lived. He sat back, staring at the lines. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind stayed sharp. Somewhere on the station, Commander Lyra was running her own test now. He hoped she saw what he saw. He hoped she believed it before it was too late. The next morning, Daniel walked through the halls and felt the weight of waiting. He moved past crews, past families boarding shuttles, past alien children laughing as they pointed at banners. He smiled faintly, but his chest stayed heavy. He knew the decision was out of his hands now. All he could do was hope that his words and numbers had planted enough doubt in the right mind. He did not want glory. He wanted to see those ships safe on the other side of the rift. That was all. And as he stood again at the observation deck, notebook in hand, he whispered into the glass that he would keep trying, even if no one believed him. Because sometimes one quiet voice was all the difference between safety and destruction. Daniel Price sat in the quiet lounge with his notebook open, but his mind was not on the pages. The review meeting still echoed in his head. The way the officers had laughed, the way the room had turned cold, the way Commander Lyra Talvin had looked at his graphs. He replayed every word, every glance. He did not know if he had made a difference or only embarrassed himself. Yet the image of the graph showing the flagship breaking apart stayed fixed in his thoughts. He could not shake it. He knew the risk was real. Outside the lounge window, the fleet stretched across the dark like a necklace of stars. Ships lined up in perfect order. Lights glowed on their hulls. They looked proud and ready. He could almost imagine the cheer of the crews inside, preparing for the crossing. But he saw something else too. He saw the line of the simulation, the sudden tilt, the sharp break. To him, each light outside looked fragile, like a candle that might vanish in a single breath. The human delegation prepared for a reception that night. Daniel did not want to go. He wanted to stay with his laptop to run more tests to find more proof. But Olivia Brooks found him in the lounge. She told him he could not hide away. She said the Arcanis officers might not believe numbers, but they might believe the calm, steady words of a man who cared enough to speak. Daniel wanted to argue, but he followed her anyway. He knew she was right. Numbers meant little if no one saw the human behind them. The reception was crowded. Music floated across the hall. Tables held food from dozens of worlds. Officers in polished uniforms spoke with ambassadors and traders. Daniel stayed near the edge, feeling out of place. But then he saw Commander Lyra across the room. She stood with two admirals, her back straight, her hands folded behind her. Daniel's heart raced. He wanted to walk over, but his feet felt heavy. It was Lyra who crossed the room to him. She asked if he had eaten. He shook his head. She handed him a plate of bread and fruit. Then she lowered her voice and said she had tested his model. Daniel froze. She told him his guardrails were not elegant, but they worked. She said the flagship held steady in her simulation. Daniel's breath caught. She told him not to look too pleased. Many officers still doubted him, but she said she had seen enough to keep asking questions. That night, Daniel returned to his room with new strength. He wrote more notes, cleaned up his code, and prepared new graphs. He wanted to be ready if she called on him again. He worked until his eyes burned, but for the first time he felt he was not alone. The next day he was summoned to another meeting. This one was smaller, just a circle of engineers and commanders. Daniel sat with his laptop open while alien officers argued around the table. Some said his idea was reckless. Some said it was dangerous to change systems so close to launch. Lyra asked for silence and told Daniel to explain. He showed the graphs again. He spoke slowly, choosing simple words. He compared the rift waves to storms at sea. He said no ship should trust calm water forever. He said sailors survived by expecting the sudden swell. He showed how his guardrails acted like hands steadying a wheel. The room stayed quiet. One of the older engineers asked if Daniel trusted his own system enough to fly with it. Daniel said yes. His voice trembled, but he meant it. Another asked why the Alliance's best minds had missed something so simple. Daniel said sometimes people loved clean answers too much and forgot to test the messy ones. His words hung in the air. Some frowned. Some nodded. When the meeting ended, nothing was decided, but Commander Lyra asked Daniel to walk with her. In the corridor, she told him the admirals were divided. Some would never accept a human's correction. Others feared the delay if they rewrote the stabilizers. But she said she was willing to risk her name on the line. She asked if he was willing to stand beside her. Daniel said yes at once. He did not think of his own pride. He thought of the children he had seen through the station windows. He thought of their small hands pressed against the glass. He said he would do anything to keep them safe. The next 3 days were a blur of work. Daniel was given a small desk in the engineering wing. He sat with teams of Arcani's engineers, their eyes sharp, their voices clipped. At first they treated him with doubt. But as hours passed, they saw his focus. They saw how he tested every line of code again and again. He explained his guardrails in simple steps, showing how they bent but did not break. He admitted where he was unsure. He never claimed perfection. Slowly, the room grew less cold. One evening, as they tested a cruiser model with the updated stabilizer system, the graphs showed the ship holding steady through wave flips. The engineers exchanged glances. Some whispered. One even clapped Daniel on the shoulder. It was not full acceptance, but it was something. Daniel felt a weight lift from his chest. Still, doubts lingered. The admirals wanted proof beyond models. They demanded a live test. A small cruiser was chosen. Crews worked through the night to install the updated stabilizers. Daniel stayed with them, helping where he could, answering questions, running checks. When the cruiser launched the next morning, he stood in the control room with Lyra and the others. The ship entered a shallow part of the rift where gravity waves surged like hidden tides. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then the wave struck. The cruiser rocked. Alarms flickered. Daniel's hands clenched, but the guardrails held. The ship wavered, then straightened. The crew's voices came over the comm, calm and steady. The cruiser survived. The room erupted in cheers. Daniel sagged against the console. Lyra allowed herself a small smile. But not everyone was convinced. Some said the test was too short, the conditions too mild. Some said it was luck. Arguments broke out. Daniel stayed silent. He knew his role was not to win arguments, but to show the numbers. He trusted the numbers. Later that night, he walked the observation deck again. He saw the fleet glowing outside, waiting. He knew the decision was close. He knew time was running out. But he also knew he had done everything he could. He had spoken, he had shown, he had tested. The rest lay in the hands of those with the power to decide. Commander Lyra found him there. She stood beside him in silence for a while. Then she said the admirals would vote in the morning. She said she had argued for him, for the guardrails, for the lives of everyone aboard. She said the choice was not hers alone, but she had done her part. Daniel nodded. He thanked her. She said no, it was he who had done the work. Then she turned and left. Daniel stayed at the glass long into the night. He thought of Earth, of his father's garage, of Olivia's steady encouragement. He thought of the faces of the children in the windows. He thought of the fleet glowing like a city among the stars. He whispered again that he would not stop. not until the ships were safe. Then he closed his notebook, knowing tomorrow would bring the answer he had been waiting for. The admirals gathered in a tall room with glass walls that looked out over the fleet. The vote was short but sharp. Some wanted to trust the old systems. Some wanted to wait and test again. Others said there was no time, that the rift corridor's window would soon close. In the end, Commander Lyra's voice carried enough weight. She said the guardrails were not elegant, but they had worked in the live test. She reminded them that the fleet carried families, not just soldiers. She said no admiral wanted to explain to those families why they had ignored a warning. When the vote ended, the decision was made. They would install the human correction on every ship. Daniel Price sat outside the room with his notebook closed in his lap. His heart thudded like a drum. When Lyra walked out and told him the news, he did not smile or cheer. He simply nodded, relief and fear mixing inside him. Relief that they would try, fear that it might still fail. The work ahead was enormous. Thousands of ships, each with its own stabilizers, each needing changes. And only days before launch. The engineering wings of the station came alive with movement. Crews ran through corridors carrying cases of tools and cables. Ships opened their bays to welcome teams. Daniel was given a small corner of the main operations room. He worked with 3 Arcanis engineers who had begun to respect his calm persistence. He showed them how to install the correction code. He explained how the guardrails worked, how they caught the drift before it broke the system. He answered every question with patience. His hands shook with fatigue, but his voice stayed steady. Days blurred into nights. Daniel often fell asleep at his desk for an hour, only to wake when another engineer shook his shoulder. He drank bitter coffee and rubbed his eyes until they burned. He thought of his father's words from long ago. Fix one piece at a time and soon the whole machine will run. That was what he did now. One line of code, one graph, one system check at a time. Not everyone welcomed him. Some engineers still muttered that it was foolish to trust a human. Some officers warned that the correction might cause new problems. Daniel listened but did not argue. He knew arguments wasted time. He kept working. The numbers on his screen told him the truth. The guardrails were simple, but they worked. Commander Lyra walked the halls each day, checking progress, speaking calm words to nervous crews. Sometimes she stopped by Daniel's desk. She would ask him how the corrections held. He would show her the graphs. She would nod and move on. She never praised him in front of the others, but her steady trust gave him strength. On the 3rd night, a small cargo ship finished its update and prepared for a deeper rift test. Daniel stood in the control room again with Lyra and the engineers. The ship entered the waves. For long minutes the hull shook. Gravity pulled in crooked bursts. The stabilizers wavered, then corrected. The ship held. The crew reported all systems safe. A cheer rose in the room. Daniel closed his eyes and breathed, but there were still doubts. An admiral warned that 1 or 2 tests did not prove safety for an entire fleet. He said the Alliance had trusted humans once before and suffered losses. Daniel listened quietly. When the admiral left, Lyra turned to Daniel and said, "You cannot change every mind, but you have given us a chance." That is enough. The work continued. More ships finished updates. More tests ran. Each time the ships held, confidence spread. Crews began to trust the guardrails. Some even smiled at Daniel when they passed him in the halls. He felt less like an outsider and more like part of the team. But he never forgot how close the fleet had been to disaster. The day before launch, Daniel walked the docking ring alone. He looked into the windows of the seed arcs where forests grew under glass. He saw children chasing each other through wide halls. He saw families packing small bags for the journey. He pressed his hand to the glass and whispered that they would be safe. He hoped the numbers kept their promise. That night, Olivia Brooks found him sitting on a bench with his notebook. She asked him if he was ready. He said no one was ever ready for something this big. But he said he had done everything he could. She told him that sometimes that was enough. She told him that if the fleet survived, people would remember his name. Daniel shook his head. He said names did not matter. What mattered were the lives that would keep shining like lights in the dark. Launch day came. The station buzzed with voices and footsteps. Crews hurried to final checks. Families gathered in cabins. The admirals gave short speeches about unity and courage. Daniel stood in the observation deck with the human delegation, but he did not listen to the speeches. His eyes stayed on the fleet outside. Ships lined up like soldiers on parade. Lights blinked in steady patterns. Engines glowed with power. The rift corridor waited ahead, dark and shifting. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The voices echoed across the station. Daniel gripped his notebook so hard his fingers hurt. 7, 6, 5. He thought of the graphs, the lines that shook and then held. 4, 3, 2. He thought of the children pressing their hands to the glass. 1. Engines flared. The fleet began to move. Daniel held his breath as the ships slid forward. One by one, they crossed the threshold into the rift. Gravity waves rose to meet them. The stabilizers hummed. On Daniel's screen, lines wavered and danced. For long seconds, nothing broke. The guardrails held. The ship stayed steady. The control room filled with voices. Reports came in from across the fleet. Hulls stable. Engines steady. Crews calm. Daniel's chest loosened. He let out a breath he had held too long. He turned to Olivia. She smiled through tears. He turned to Lyra. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on the screens, her face calm but her hands tight behind her back. Hours passed. Waves struck again and again. The ship swayed but did not break. The guardrails adjusted each time. The fleet moved deeper into the rift. Daniel felt the tension ease, but he knew it was not over. The rift was long, and it had broken fleets before. He stayed at his desk, eyes fixed on the lines, heart beating with every wave. When the first day ended and the fleet was still intact, cheers broke across the station. Crews sang. Families hugged. But Daniel stayed quiet. He knew the rift was not finished. He whispered to himself that they must hold for 2 more days, maybe 3. He knew the hardest part still lay ahead. That night, he did not sleep. He walked the halls of the station, listening to the hum of engines, the whispers of crews, the laughter of children. He thought of Earth, of the garage where he had first learned patience. He thought of his father's voice telling him that even small hands could keep a machine alive. He thought of how far those small lessons had carried him, and he promised himself he would not rest until the fleet was safe on the other side of the dark. Daniel Price sat with his eyes fixed on the glowing lines of data. The rift corridor was not kind. Gravity waves slammed into the ships in sudden bursts, bending hulls, twisting stabilizers, shaking families from their sleep. For 3 long days, the fleet fought the storm of the dark. Daniel lived at his desk in the control room, eating when he was told, drinking coffee that burned his throat, sleeping only in minutes when his eyes closed by force. He knew the ships were strong, but he also knew they lived now on the fragile lines of correction he had written. Each wave came like a test. The stabilizers shifted, the guardrails caught the drift, and the ships righted themselves. The graphs on Daniel's screen wavered but did not collapse. Each time a ship steadied, his chest loosened for a moment before tightening again. He thought of the children, of the forests and the seed arcs, of the families who trusted the admirals with their lives. He whispered to himself again and again, "Hold steady, just hold steady." The second night was the hardest. A surge hit harder than any before. One of the freighters tilted so far that its alarms screamed across the comm. Daniel jumped from his chair, fingers flying across the keys, running checks, shouting numbers. The guardrails caught the drift just before the freighter would have spun out of range. The comm crackled with the voice of its captain, steady but shaken, reporting that the ship was safe. Daniel sat back down, his hands trembling. He knew then that without the correction, the freighter would already be gone. Commander Lyra stood behind him through those long hours. She rarely spoke, but her presence was solid. When officers argued, when doubts rose, she kept her eyes on the screens and her voice calm. At one point, she leaned close to Daniel and said, "They are holding because of you. Do not forget that." Daniel shook his head. He said they were holding because crews were brave and ships were strong. She did not argue. She let him believe what he needed, but in her eyes, he saw she meant her words. By the 3rd day, the fleet had passed deeper into the corridor. The waves grew less sharp, less cruel, though still strong enough to test every system. Daniel's body ached with exhaustion. His voice was hoarse from calling numbers and answering questions, but his mind stayed sharp. He watched every line, until his vision blurred, then washed his face and kept going. He knew the end was close. He could almost feel the calmer space on the other side of the rift. And then, finally, the waves began to ease. One by one, the reports came in. Hulls steady, stabilizers calm, engines strong. The ships pushed out of the corridor into open space. The stars beyond the rift shone like a promise. Daniel stared at his screen, hardly daring to believe. Then the final report came. The fleet was intact. Not one ship lost, not one family gone. The control room erupted in cheers. Officers clapped each other on the back. Some even clapped Daniel's shoulder, their eyes bright with gratitude. Daniel sat still for a moment, letting the noise wash over him. His hands shook. His chest felt light. He closed his notebook and set it down. He thought of the moment when he had almost stayed silent, when he had almost let fear hold him back. He thought of how close they had come to destruction. And he thought of the simple guardrails, the crude code, the stubborn insistence that messy truth mattered more than clean pride. Those things had saved lives. Commander Lyra walked to the center of the room. She raised her hand for silence. When the noise faded, she spoke in a voice that carried through every corner. She said the fleet had survived not only because of Arcani's strength, but because a human engineer had seen what others had missed. She said Daniel Price had given them a chance to live when the rift would have taken them. She said the Alliance owed him their thanks. The room filled with cheers again, this time for Daniel. He felt his face flush. He stood awkwardly, nodding, not knowing what to say. He did not want glory. He wanted the lights outside the windows to keep shining. That night, celebrations filled the station. Music played in the halls. Families danced. Children laughed. Admirals raised their glasses in toasts. Daniel slipped away from the crowd. He found a quiet place on the observation deck. He pressed his hand to the glass and looked at the fleet spread across the stars. They looked calm now, like a city at rest after a storm. He whispered a small promise to himself. He would never forget that lives depended on small details, that even a quiet voice could change the course of many. Olivia Brooks found him there. She told him he should be proud. She told him Earth would hear his name. He smiled faintly. He said names did not matter. He said what mattered was that the ships had made it through. She nodded and stood beside him in silence, both of them looking at the lights beyond the glass. In the days that followed, word of what had happened spread. Crews told the story of the human who had seen the flaw. Admirals sent messages of thanks. Families spoke his name with gratitude. Daniel accepted their words quietly, never seeking more than a nod of acknowledgement. He returned to his desk, his notebook, his numbers. He knew there would always be more storms, more risks, more chances for mistakes. He would be ready to see them, ready to speak, ready to steady the machine again. When the human delegation prepared to return to Earth, Daniel packed his small bag with his notebook, his laptop, and little else. Commander Lyra met him at the shuttle bay. She told him that the Alliance would not forget him. She said he had given them more than a correction. He had shown them a way of thinking that thrived in uncertainty. She said the galaxy needed that. Daniel thanked her, his voice soft. She offered her hand. He shook it firmly. Then he boarded the shuttle. As the shuttle pulled away, Daniel looked back at the fleet one last time. The ships gleamed in the light of distant stars, alive and safe. He felt a swell of quiet pride, not for himself, but for the fact that they were still there, still moving, still shining. He whispered again, "Hold steady." Then he turned to face Earth, ready to return home, carrying with him the knowledge that one careful voice, one stubborn insistence on the truth, had saved an entire fleet from certain destruction.